We're now going to do the flower beds on the right side of the short hedge. The upper right garden has a soft pastel color because we're a bit in the background. The stitch has two parts, a long horizontal cross and then a small cross stitch. So the thread we're using for this stitch and the color of your fabric are very close to each other, and it may be hard to see the holes of your fabric. So the lap cloth I'm showing has white on one side and is dark on the other side. For my purposes, putting the white on my lap helps me see these holes through my canvas. Sometimes I like to use a lap cloth that's red. It shows the holes very well. So to do this stitch, I'm going to start just above the design line. My stitch goes over 4 fabric threads and down 1. This is my long horizontal cross, and then my second stitch goes on top. My next stitch comes up in the center of that first stitch. Again, over 4 and down 1, going to put me just to the right of my previous stitch, and continue doing my cross stitch, again being careful that my crosses are all going in the same direction. I'm going to work up the design line, and the very last stitch that I take is going to be right on the design line. It's going to share the design line with the hedge that's just above it. Okay. Here is my long diagonal cross stitch, and you can see that there are fabric intersections showing between the stitches. With the 18 count canvas, I chose to do a little cross stitch using just one strand of a slightly deeper colored thread. You almost don't see it, but it does cover that intersection. Now with linen, that intersection was so small and the color of my thread so close to the color of the linen itself that I just omitted this little cross stitch and let the fabric play an active role by letting it show. You will notice that you'll need to do some compensated stitches on either side of the design area and maybe against the tree trunk. But again, go up to the design line at the top and on the bottom. You're stitched right on that design line. The garden flower bed, which is labeled G6 in the upper middle right, has a lovely light blue thread. Blue is analogous to yellow on our color wheel, and analogous colors have a feeling of harmony when they're placed next to each other. So this garden area is stitched in a small upright cross stitch. I take my vertical stitch over 2 fabric threads and then a horizontal stitch. My next stitch, I'm coming down just below my prior upright cross stitch, doing the vertical stitch over 2 and then the horizontal stitch over 2. Now when I get to my 3rd stitch, I'm coming up in a shared hole, so I want to angle my needle so that I don't split any threads of that first cross stitch. And I continue across the design line following this little pattern of zigging up and down to do upright cross stitches. Now I want you to look at the chart in your instruction booklet to notice that when I come back in the other direction, my horizontal stitch is going to go in the other direction. So while I'm doing it now from left to right, when I come back in the other direction, the horizontal stitch is going to go from right to left. You're going to notice that there is exposed canvas between this area and the one just above it, but we'll cover that up with some finishing stitches toward the end of stitching the piece. The lower middle garden is done using a padded brick stitch. We first want to lay a long thread and then take vertical stitches over that long thread. I would say a long thread of 30 to 36 inches would be a good length for this stitch. So I'm going to bring up my thread. You'll bring it up on the design line, but so that you can see it a little better in this demonstration, I'm just below the design line. My first stitch is a long laid stitch, and I'm placing my needle between the strands of this stitch. It's called railroading, and that's going to help place these strands absolutely next to each other when I bring my needle down to the back of my canvas. Now I'm going to do the vertical brick stitch. So this is just a little vertical stitch going over 2 canvas threads. You skip 2 fabric threads for your next stitch, so you're going to have an empty fabric channel or a hole between each of your brick stitches, and as you stitch back, you're going to be anchoring that long laid thread in place. Be sure that your stitches aren't too tight. As you take them, you want a fairly loose tension, particularly on that long laid thread. You go all the way back until you reach your design line, and then you're going to place another long laid thread. And again, if you put your needle between those 2 strands of the thread, you'll be railroading, and it will place the 2 strands absolutely next to each other. Now I'm doing a second row. You want to notice that the long laid thread is immediately below my first laid thread. In other words, you're going to lay a long thread in every single thread channel. And this time my vertical brick stitch is coming up between the stitches that I took in my first row. I need to angle my needle so that it goes under the laid thread. I want to be sure to go over 2 fabric threads, angling my needle to go under the laid thread above. If by mistake you happen to go in the same channel as your laid thread, you're just going to pull it down and skew it. You do then this padded brick stitch for the entire design area, and then we're going to put some flowers on top. So on top of our padded brick stitch, we're going to begin to put some flowers. In the background, a small partial eyelet stitch. We'll just scatter some flowers. They're fairly flat without too much dimension, but they do begin to have a little bit of color. And to do this eyelet, I'm just going to take several stitches into a common center hole. That's what creates the eyelet. I could put in 3 stitches like I just did, or perhaps 4 or 5 stitches. The color of my orange thread is just a soft orange, somewhat on the pastel side, because I'm still working toward the background of my piece. So for this, I'll just add another little stitch for this eyelet. And I want to scatter them in this background area of the padded brick stitch. You don't have to put too many because, again, just like with the color, we're in the background area. It can be a little bit more sparsely filled with flowers. Below the partial eyelet stitches, we're going to scatter some French knots. Again, you want to do a single wrap over your needle, but you might want to add another strand to your thread, to your needle, to make the knot a little larger than those French knots that you did earlier. And again, you can take your needle down to the left or right, or just above where you've brought up your needle to give a little bit of movement to those flowers. And put a couple of these French knots on the right side of the tree trunk.